So, thanks for coming today. It's amazing to be back in Berlin. I usually come once a year around this sort of time. And for some reason, you always seem to be having a heat wave. So I always associate Berlin with like sunny, hot, very, very open, fun-loving time. So I absolutely love Berlin for that. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to go to different cities and countries around the world to talk about, design and user experience and stuff. And although it's work, you do get to experience some of the city as well, which is fantastic. And anything's better than Brexit at the moment. So one of the first times I talked around this and started running workshops that I'm going to be talking to you about today, I was at a conference in Brazil in a place called Floripa, which is an absolutely beautiful place. And as I was sharing all these great photos and kind of comments around walking on the beach, practicing my talk and all these sorts of things, some people might have assumed I was having the time of my life and like living this kind of great jet-setting lifestyle, going to beautiful places in Brazil and seeing the beautiful things there. Unfortunately, I was actually having some of the darkest periods of my life at the time. 2 weeks earlier, I was back in London working in this building. Some of you may know what that is. And I was working for my client, who was a bank. And my client had been going through a strategic review by a management consultancy that begins with an M. And they'd been reviewing everything around their processes, their approach to the product and service they were creating. And I was sort of working more closely with the client, and I'd been working on similar stuff around their strategy and the process going forwards. And I'd come up with a strategy for the work ahead, and it's one of these management meetings that I was due to go into where you had to submit the papers in advance so that everyone could review it and you could have a very productive, efficient meeting. And I was meant to have a very clear outcome at the end of it. And so I was all geared up for this meeting. I had a haircut and everything, and all geared up for this meeting. It kept on getting pushed back. The meetings preceding mine kept on getting pushed further and further back in time. And so all the adrenaline I had was just kind of like wasting away as I was ready to go in. And in a practice, to kind of keep things on time, I had about 20 minutes. And eventually they said, right, time is ready to go on. And so I entered a room, and it was not dissimilar to this. There was only one person on my client side, but it was a Cisco telepresence room, so sort of hyper-real, and there was various people on the other end in Switzerland somewhere who were engaging with it, and including the main sponsor. And I came in, and the main sponsor just kind of sort of said, "Can you keep it quick?" And I was like, "Well, how long have you got?" Because I'm going to rehearse things, I've sent things in advance, and I just want to make sure I use the best use of the time. And so I said, well, how much time have you got? And he said, well, just keep it quick, and sort of banged on the table. I don't know if you've ever had an experience like that. It's not very fun. So suddenly I was kind of all positive and happy, and suddenly my back was up. And I asked, had anyone read the materials I sent in advance? There was tumbleweed. I was like, okay. And he said, assume no one's read it. Okay. Oh, okay, fine. Okay. So I'm just going to have to go through very quickly. Let's try and keep the questions to the end. But if you have any concerns, please voice them as we go. And I tried to then deliver this presentation as quickly and as clearly as I possibly could. And they didn't like what I said. It was somewhat provocative, and I left without getting the answers that I needed. The next day, I was at a leading design conference, a conference for design leaders, and this lady, Julia Whitney, was talking. She was talking about vulnerability and how it's important for leaders to be aware of their own vulnerability and to share it for others. And at the end of her presentation, I received this email from my client. So I'll just boost this up. Now, I don't know if any of you have had an email like that. It was the worst email I've ever received. All of these points are sort of the antithesis of what I hope to achieve with my clients and to work with, and the sort of reactions to the things that I've invested in my career to deal with. So this came as a really big shock, and so I was devastated. It was like a punch to the gut. And so I caught Julia in the break. She's actually an executive coach, and said, I think I need your help. And so she soon became my coach. And a big part of the coaching process is around self-reflection, because I felt there was a disconnect between the way I was seeing myself and the way maybe my client was seeing myself, given that email. And I wanted to make sure that these things were better aligned. So I needed to look into myself and kind of figure out, like, who am I? What am I about? And I knew that it was more than, the various titles I give myself to try and describe what I do, because I know it's more complicated than that, and go a bit deeper. So I wanted to look into aspects of my personal life, my kind of more work, vocational life, and the sort of aspects of the community work that I do. And just a little bit of an overview that I was considering, my relationships with my wife and my children, also my hobbies, my background is sort of a DJ back in the days and wanting to make more music if I can get the time, but kids kind of get in the way of that. And I had the opportunity to get a scholarship to a private school back in England, which was interesting and a great opportunity, but it was very, very hard for me because I was browner than the other people there, and I got a lot of racist abuse, much like Mesut, who shares the name like I do. And in my work life, I started off as doing web design, but I studied industrial design. And over the years, I went into a management consultancy myself, actually, and learned those business consulting ways. But I also developed a lot in the user experience space, eventually becoming a design leader by accident, and also becoming more of a strategist. And related to maybe some of you here, like attendees at conference, I started out going to events and conferences and becoming a reader, ultimately becoming a leader and then a writer, but also becoming a speaker and a local leader for the Interaction Design Association. So I've invested a lot in the community. I think it's valuable. I like to pay back as much as possible, and a lot of this work is to do with that. So me in a snapshot, I suppose. But it was important for me to look at myself through these different lenses, because if you just look at yourself from a work lens, it's not realistic. Your personal life will compete in the various ways. One of the first tasks that Julia gave me was to map a timeline of my career history. So the idea was to kind of map like the various places I'd worked and map the emotional sort of highs and lows and scores along that experience. And as you can see, it's quite wild and mountainous in various ways. And the idea was that trying to kind of like mark the different highs and lows and almost kind of think about the different themes that made me happy, made me very upset, made me very anxious. And that was a timeline view, but she also gave me these radial charts, like a little basic framework that I would write different words on that were around different areas of my work me and my personal life me. And then to kind of score myself out of 10 on how happy I was in each of these different areas. And this was really, really interesting from a self-reflection point of view. As you can see, I marked myself really low on lots of different aspects, so I was obviously really unhappy with myself. But later on, I realized that was because I have these sort of perfectionist tendencies, and it creates me greater anxiety. And a lot of designers have this, where they're never really happy in any particular area. They can always see room for improvement. But it was interesting that things around the community and my profile and my network and children, etc., kind of come up. And interesting, the community kind of existed in my work and my personal life as well. I've developed lots of friendships within the community, so they kind of ended up overlapping. So these were really interesting to kind of look at myself over time, and look at myself over these different dimensions. By doing this, I was able to better focus on what was really important to me and to plan ahead for it. And I took the sort of framework I used for the presentation to my client and actually applied it to myself. It was like a kind of base strategic framework, where I kind of outlined a vision for myself, which I've hidden here, and initiatives which I've hidden as well, but kind of communicate some clear outcomes of what I wanted to achieve in my life, in my work life, and my personal life, and also think through the types of ways I wanted to come across the principles of my behavior. So, what did I want to achieve, and how did I want to do it, in what way? It's very similar to kind of like any sort of strategy and design strategy things. And this really helped to define my purpose and hone where I was going to focus and the projects I was going to do and invest in myself. And I really didn't think I would ever use a Michael Jackson quote. It gets harder and harder to use Michael Jackson quotes for various reasons. It gets harder and harder to play Michael Jackson music anymore. But, there's something about the fact that you, in order to kind of change the world around you and to kind of improve things, you might need to look at yourself and help to make the change first in yourself, because you are easier to change than everyone else, potentially. So here we are in 2019, and part of the career plan that I developed with Julia was to build on some older work that I'd recently been reviving to help the design community, to help profile others and help see themselves better. And this is against a backdrop of challenges for an industry in its heyday. We have an increasing demand for our services, a greater hubris around what design and designers can do. We've developed an ever-growing list of titles, skills, and methods, and we're expected to be able to be proficient in all of these different areas. It gets confusing for us, and it gets confusing for others who are trying to discern the differences of these different people. And if anyone in here has to hire designers, user experience people, it's getting harder, and I'm sure it's getting harder in Berlin. In London, it's really, really difficult to hire people. But more importantly, it's even harder to retain those people for a decent amount of time. And all of this is against the backdrop of constantly changing technology, where new emerging technology, various aspects of machine learning and AI, AR, VR, whatever, seem to pollute our own career development as we try to kind of embrace these new tools and all the different prototyping things that we can do these days. So all of this backdrop is quite an interesting backdrop in terms of some of the challenges that the industry itself faces. And a lot of people who do work in this area around skills and competencies and profiling often resort to this thing called a career ladder. I don't know if you've seen a career ladder or progression framework. Various things that try to indicate the different types of skills or capabilities that you're meant to have and how they might change according to a particular level that you are within the organization. And these usually end up as spreadsheets, and they usually end up quite large because it's quite complex. They become really difficult to create. Many organizations are actually partway through. They started the initiative and then they stopped. They're really, really hard to update once you've created them. And they're really, really difficult for designers especially to engage with them. I think one of the biggest challenges with these things and these tools is they provide an illusion of exhaustiveness. So if you're someone who is a designer and your skills aren't on here, you kind of think, well, where do I fit? Or you kind of assume that this is going to got everything. And if you do all those different stages, you can guarantee a promotion or a pay rise or something, and that's not always the case. I don't think a lot of the time they're flexible for the diversity you might want to encourage in the teams, and that's diversity beyond race, gender, and all the other psycho sides of the diversity. So I try to steer away from the career ladder stuff. Some of my work ends up informing them, but I don't think as a tool they're as effective as they need to be. So just a little bit of context, for a period of 3 years, I was doing a lot of hiring. It was several years ago now, but I still got exposed to a lot of different people in the industry. And over my, almost 20-year career, I've had exposure to thousands of designers of various sorts and worked very closely with hundreds of them. So reviewed a lot of CVs, a lot of portfolios. And I've led and I've managed, I've hired many of these people. So I have a view. It's mostly a London, UK-oriented view, but I do have people that I'm connecting with across the world around this. And surprise, surprise, one of the biggest learnings I have is that we're all different. We're all different, like snowflakes are different in some ways. And in fact, designers are like snowflakes in this sort of negative connotations of a snowflake that's used for millennials these days. They're very delicate a lot of the times. Their egos are very delicate. They have a lot of passion, but their emotions can come to the fore quite frequently, and they lack a lot of confidence a lot of the time. So very similar to snowflakes in both understandings of that word. I think it's quite interesting. This is my friend Sami, who runs IXEA Helsinki and the agency Nordcap. And this is the back of his business card. It's brilliant. I love it. What he does is when he meets someone, he crosses off various terms so that it's like, for you, I am this. And so, you know, he could be head of motion development one day, or he could be boss queen of concept another day. And so it's an interesting way to kind of like communicate some of the complexity and then narrow it down. For you, I am this. I think that's quite interesting. I think all the team have different versions of these. But it's confusing. It's a symptom. It's a symptom of the many titles and stuff that we give each other for doing sometimes something that's a similar job that people still do not understand. Many tools exist, frameworks and models that help to kind of decode the complexity. So many of you might have seen a T-shaped model or seen that concept before, where there's this idea that you might have some broad coverage of certain skills and you go deep in one area. Or Jared Spool talks about the broken comb people, so the idea that you're actually deeper in many different areas and there's different depths to those different areas. This is a model I quite like, and I just gutted that he kind of coined it. This one is, I think, called the UX spectrum, which pits like research on one side and graphic design on the other, and there's some really nice visuals that go along with this. And all of these are really, really useful. None of them are perfect, but they're useful in kind of seeing yourself in different ways. Various people have been writing about this, but this article came out a couple of years ago, and I thought it was quite interesting. It talks about these different roles and titles and how it's getting really confusing, and how there's becoming an emergence of a designer that kind of focuses on one specific type of technology, say like voice or AR, and then kind of starts to kind of do things around the edges. And he's kind of like talking about different shapes of design, and that one in particular is quite illustrative. Apologies. But it's actually a good article. He cheapens it with this shot, but it's memorable, you know, designers doing design. So, we're all different. These models help. They all help to frame our perspectives in different ways. And like the tools that I was using with Julia, they can help you see and understand yourself in different ways. You can map yourself. You don't have to just use one. You can use many. So as I developed various tools in the past, I thought, oh, I could start running these workshops and actually try to create a better model with the data that I would be gathering. And I could use a mixture of models to do that. So I started creating these shaping workshops, and I've written a lot about this. Some of you may have seen some of this online. If not, you can follow some of the detail afterwards. And there still might be some spaces tomorrow in the all-day workshop we've got. And the idea is that I was going to try to use these visual frameworks to help in a number of ways. Firstly, to engage designers in their own self-reflection. So similar to what I was going through working with Julia, to use them as a way, as different lenses to see yourself. Secondly, that I could gather more data to develop more robust industry models, which I could then share back to the community. And thirdly, I could help develop stronger, more bespoke competency frameworks for organizations as well. It might lead to career ladders, it might be used for other things, but they would be more tailored based off a kind of more robust framework, which you could have some benchmarking against. So I believe I could do these workshops to help in all of these ways. And I've had the opportunity, I don't know if I've updated this map recently, to do this at various design conferences around the world, with various organizations around the world. And sometimes I haven't been able to get to certain places. So I've talked through with various design leaders or managers who want to run these workshops in their city or in their organization. And ideally, they would have been part of one of the workshops to know what it feels like, or I would coach them through how to do it. And so this has helped to kind of spread some of these things. And actually, even just this week, I found out 3 or 4 different people have been using the tools in different ways in their organizations. And so all I ask is that they kind of share some of the data and share what they learn from it. So this stuff is spreading in a way. So I just want to give you a kind of a bit of an overview of the types of tools that I use to kind of run these workshops. So you might take a similar approach in your organization or to do it with yourself. The first thing we do is we use these visual tools to help sort of gather some data. And I think more importantly, they help to prime the thinking. By thinking through different lenses, no matter how imperfect they are, it helps you to think about yourself differently, because you might not have looked at yourself through a particular lens before. And they help you to also, if you do this in a team environment, or even in a kind of conference environment, especially if you anonymize it, which is key, you can see that there's a lot of variety and difference across many of the different things. It's almost impossible, I've found, to find someone who is exactly the same across every single framework, because we're all different. And then what happens afterwards in the second sort of part of the workshop is people develop bespoke maps and frameworks for themselves. They identify the particular competency areas that they want to develop in, that they are strong in, that they want to be used as their identity. And this helps to identify in an organizational context where someone might be able to also help other people, to be a mentor to other people in their own development, and also to identify where someone might want to grow themselves and be a mentee. And you can do some really interesting stuff where you can kind of map the people who want to help, the mentors, with the mentees who want to be developed, and potentially kind of use your training budget for areas which can't be supported within your organization. So it can be really useful to kind of pull together a kind of training initiative within your organization. So what I'll do is just give you an overview of some of the frameworks. I've written quite extensively around a lot more of these, but I'll take you through some of these so you get a bit of a feel. So the first one I do is a career timeline. I was doing this before Julia did it to me. There's some slight differences, but it's always helpful to map this out. So don't spend as long. I did mine on a flight, not the whole flight, but some of the flight. But we do a similar thing. We track kind of positive and negative emotions against like a timeline of particular jobs that you may have had, and also a level of seniority. And what I've observed with myself is that it gets a bit erratic near the end. And it does with other people if they go into leadership and management people. There's a lot of people that I know, friends of mine and other peers, who are having a kind of harder time as they get more experience. But also, what you do tend to find is that recent experience is kind of, you get a lot more resolution in the sort of data because of your memory is stronger, and you will observe more negativity than you might have from the past as well. So that one kind of sets a good context. It's a thing called blob mapping. It wasn't always called blob mapping, but I'm just going to call it blob mapping. Other people have called it the UX amoeba. It's been one of the most popular visual frameworks I've used over the years. It's actually an adaptation of an adaptive path model that I think might have put design research and some of these things, and used it as a kind of way to explain things. But what some of my colleagues, one in particular, Warren Hutchinson, when we were at LBI, did was to try and get people to map their shape onto it, to kind of like show the level of strength in different areas. So you would get people drawing these different shapes. So, you know, I'm like stronger in interaction design, use the research, and add an arrow, so like I want to grow an experience strategy, say. And it's always interesting to do this. I used to do this in interviews, actually, to kind of just get a sense of someone, and I would draw my shape, and then they would draw theirs, and I would say, oh, okay, it'd be really good to kind of see some more work in this area that you're saying you're strong in, because then that gives people an opportunity to talk around the things that matter to them. And it's always interesting. You can see maybe faintly there's some annotations on here. It's really interesting to do with your team members, your line manager or your line report, to actually have a discussion. What does this mean for you? Just do it quickly and then explain what it means. It's a really interesting framework, and it's one of the more bizarre visually ones. I never really understood it, but people love this one. I think because of its simplicity. So I did extend it out to another quadrant, and that was to kind of deal with more of the design teams that I was being part of to lead, having more of the UI visual designers within them. And so I wanted to integrate motion graphics and information design and visual language and break down UI design, visual design as a kind of like a collapsed term into sort of more separate entities, because they're very, very different skills and capabilities that you have in those different areas. And it didn't quite fit necessarily within a UI design role, but in a more creative communications agency, you would have a lot more copywriting. And I felt that writing was a skill, a competency that was going to be really valuable for everything from interface to IA to experience strategy as well. So I wanted to make sure that copywriting was represented. So these are things that you can do really quickly and can be really, really valuable. And the arrows can help to kind of indicate where you think you might want to grow and change that shape. And someone's created an online tool. I think if you search for UX Amoeba, you can kind of pull at certain ones, but you'll only get that shape there. Several years ago, what kind of kick-started my interest in this area again was a recruitment agency called Vitamin T. Used to be Aquent. Wanted to kind of extend and build on some of the old work I'd done and create a new sort of digital tool. And so I quickly supported them in developing a more up-to-date framework that you could kind of use online, and just the idea was that employers could use it and the talent could use it themselves. You could get some form of match. You can check that URL out and have a go later. It's quite a quick and easy thing to do. It just about works on mobile phones. The main things I would say on here is that we had a lot of debate around product strategy and customer experience versus service design as an aspect. The service design has been growing, but we were comfortable with adding content strategy, and we might be reconsidering that and kind of like reframing that as content design. We explicitly broke out quantitative research and qualitative research because that was something that was coming up quite a lot. And I was against the idea of collapsing things down to visual design, but that's what their clients were talking more about. Now, again, it's imperfect, doesn't have everything. It probably should have service design. It probably should break down visual design more, but it's a fairly good model. It's fairly up to date. And I think what's interesting is when you start pitting these kind of other types of roles, so UX strategist or service design or product designer, UI/UX designer, you could start sort of mapping out the sort of patterns of where the expectations are around the skills. So for example, a product designer and UI/UX designer are usually quite similar, but maybe a product designer should have more expectation on the product strategy rather than just an interface focus. But a service designer would be more focused on the customer experience, maybe less so on the interface aspects. An UX strategist wouldn't necessarily be expected to be very strong on UI aspects of the puzzle. So all these things can be quite interesting to kind of map out. But again, these are just some example terms. So I wanted to just do a little bit of it's not a test, but I just wanted to kind of do a bit of data gathering and get a sense of the room and your awareness. And this is going to be reliant on internet connectivity. But if you can go to menti.com, menti.com, just kind of start capturing some of the sort of key disciplines or fields you think are important in the user experience digital design world. And let me know if that form doesn't work. You should get kind of like 8 form fields or something. Has anyone got that? Keep your head down until you've submitted, otherwise you'll be influenced. This is just to entertain the people who were quick on it. So it's interesting. I mean, some of these things I wouldn't necessarily class as fields and disciplines, but there's a lot of fluidity between these different areas. So I would say, you know, research is really important, visual design, obviously interaction design. Things like empathy is not necessarily a field of work. Well, it could be a field of work, I suppose, in psychology. And there's a lot of sort of more of a longer tail. So if you haven't finished, just submit what you've got so far. You don't have to fill them all out. But I think it's always interesting to gather that data and see what people think is important. Okay. So the other thing, some of you have probably seen these sort of UX, UI memes. Similarly to kind of when I was used to kind of get people to draw these shapes, I would ask people, are you more UX or UI? This was before the memes. And it was sort of a deliberately tricky question. The interesting thing was how they answered it. And if someone said they were more UI than UX, I wanted to see examples in their portfolio if they hadn't seen them so far. And the other way around too, if they said they were more UX than UI, I would say, well, stop showing me interface stuff. Show me something more about the process. And so I thought, well, what are some other dichotomies that you could kind of draw out? And so I kind of, you know, used UX and UI, research and design, strategy and delivery, some of these other things. Now, some of these many of them aren't really opposites. But it's an interesting thinking tool, priming tool, to try and get people to put themselves on these scales. And what I ask people to do is to try to kind of put like brackets to kind of show how deep into on a particular area do you go. So what's your spread? And then where's your like center of gravity? Where are you most comfortable? And again, you can add arrows to either the edges or the kind of that center of gravity to kind of where you might want to shift. And it's quite a difficult exercise to do because they're not opposites really all the time, but it makes you think a lot harder about things, which is a great priming tool. So I'm going to do another little kind of data gathering thing, and that's to ask what are the most important qualities of a modern day designer. So some of you may have mentioned some of these things before. So rather than the disciplines, so like fields of practice, what are the qualities of a modern day designer, do you think? And let me just check. That's going to go to the right one. I might have to move it on. Keep your head down if you haven't completed it. Great. So if you haven't submitted, just stop now and submit. See there. Now, unsurprisingly, every time I do this, except for once, empathy has always been the largest. Now, if you're following various social media around user experience and design at the moment, you will see this being challenged. The notion of empathy being the most important quality will be being challenged a lot. I've written some kind of fairly naive views on the power of empathy and and how little we actually practice as designers. There's a lot of people writing kind of more cogently around this, but it always comes up, except for once, as the biggest. So annoyingly, things like creativity, imagination are always underneath empathy, which I find bizarre as a designer. I don't know if you can see this, but it reminds me of this comic. See if I can zoom in. So I'll try and read some stuff out from it. So Steve Bot, we need to install some empathy subroutines to upgrade your performance. Bzz, define empathy. It's a proven step-based process that will make you a better designer. You know, get into your users' heads and get a taste for how they think, see what they see, that sort of thing. Ka-thunk. Bzz, update complete. Great. Why don't you try it out on Brad here? Empathizing. Bzz, get into your user's head. Taste how they think, see what they see, empathize. Maybe we should get him on service mapping instead. And so I think there's just the ways in which we talk about empathy, if you take them more literally, can get a bit bizarre. Great set of comics, design thinking comic. I've got one more reference in here from one of my friends. So back in 2005, I asked a similar question, what makes a good kind of designer, or user experience, or actually experience architect? And I didn't ask about qualities, but I got a lot of stuff that was around teamwork, and empathy was in there, but it was empathy for not just users, it was business people as well, other developers and stakeholders. You know, the people that will actually get things done. So just trying to make sure you understand that. And a lot around teamwork and people relationship skills. So a lot of people talk about most of the things on here as soft skills or human skills, and a lot of the debate around those. But these were the most important things coming back from the people that I asked. And so I created a poster where we translated these things into visual metaphors, and which were quite useful as a poster. And then we created the frameworks to use to assess, get people to peer review different people in the team to see how strongly people were against each of these different dimensions. And no one was super strong in all areas. What we realized, there was no such thing as a perfect designer. They would always have to complement each other. It depended on the particular task at hand. So this was really useful, and I used to use it in recruitment fairs all the time to kind of illustrate what we were looking for. And people in the workshops, I usually give people a little more time on this one because it's still really valuable, and I get a lot of the data back from it. Another one that's come out is off the back of myself trying to get a job and getting rejected and not getting a clear answer why. I had to chase the rejection. I started looking into, well, what is it expected of a design leader these days? And as I started using this framework that I'll show you in a second with other people, I recognized that it was valuable for designers at all levels. And in fact, it could be useful for any developer, product manager, or whatever, because leadership qualities aren't necessarily associated with a title of a leader or a manager. So the ways I structured is kind of think about responsibility. So, you know, the vision and strategy, kind of laddering up to the business side of things, connecting with the community, the external community, growing and managing teams and developing individuals, thinking about quality, ensuring the strategic and the end solution quality, practice, which is about methods and process, design systems probably fit in there, collaboration with other people across the organization, as well as developing the capabilities, the design capabilities across the organization as well. And then lastly, advocacy, selling. And I get people to map, like, you know, how much time they spend relatively across these different areas. And again, no one's kind of spends all their time at a high level across all these areas. There's always different shapes. And you can ask different questions like how comfortable or how happy are you doing these sorts of things as well. And you get some really interesting answers. And you can also kind of identify, you know, where you think you should be investing as a design function. So kind of add arrows. And it's quite interesting when you do that. You ask teams to do that, and then their leaders do the same sort of thing and see the deltas. So that's been a really useful framework to develop. And as part of these sessions, often what we do is we put the charts up, and they're anonymous, and you can kind of start to spot patterns and have interesting discussions around them. It looks cool, but you know, sometimes it can be quite hard to read. It's quite a lot of things. And as I mentioned earlier, there's always someone who will say, but what about this? You've missed something. You've missed this thing. And you could go on and on and on. Several years ago, I developed a spreadsheet matrix that had about 70 different areas that we were expecting people to be strong in. And it took me ages to fill it out and mark myself. And everyone's like, oh, you're not really good in all these different areas. I was going, well, no, there's so many. You can't expect to be. And it was really involved to complete again and to update and all those other things. And I thought, well, if I was to kind of update this, what would it be like? So kind of I was on the train and I decided to kind of start typing away like all the different things that I thought were important these days. And I came up with a spreadsheet of about 250 items within about 30, 40 minutes. And I just tweeted about it because I thought it was just so ridiculous. And someone said, you should make it into an open spreadsheet. And then within a few hours, there was 500 items. Now, that's not grouped and distilled and deduped and all those sorts of things, but it's a lot of things that we're expected to do as a designer. And it reminds me of this comment, which is, you probably read this one, designers should know how to code, right? That old trope. Designers should know how to write. Designers should know business. So what baseline grid are you using on that layer? I don't need to know that shit. So all the things that we are doing are diluting the potential of the things that we are actually expected to be really, really good at. And I think this comic always kind of sums up some of the challenges in this. And some of the people really enjoy, doing detailed UI design, but there's an anxiety around how valuable that is to other people. So at the end of these workshops, I get people to kind of create their own shape, and I prime them to think about like their own self, as well as the teams that they're in, and the industry pressures that you get quite a lot from Twitter and social media, as well as the business needs and expectations in the organization that they're in. And then to try and then identify the different competency skill areas, or soft skills, human qualities, or whatever, that they want to use to represent them, and then score themselves on it. And then use like different colored skittles in this example, or counters you can use to kind of identify like where you want to develop. And you're going to get a limited set. But also like mark which, in a different color, where you could help someone else. And I think this is really important. It's been really, really valuable because you get different shapes and people get creative at this point and get kind of more tactile, which I think is important. But what we've been able to do is I get people to identify and write cards for any ones of the areas in which they want to develop, or they could help someone else, and write down how they would expect to be developed or what they would do to help develop someone else. And this can be really useful when you pit them against each other and you map them out. So in this example, these orange ones are examples of people who can help others. So there's a visual and UI design stream, like 8 or 9 people who can help visual and UI design, only one person who wants to be developed in it. Versus the flip on the strategy side, and it's like going, well, okay, well, that's maybe the one where you want to go outside for some external investment in that area. But you don't need to get any external investment training in UI design because you've got all the people in your organization. And maybe you're a bit heavily weighted in that way. So you can see some interesting patterns, and the team can start helping develop itself. You can get really geeky and start kind of pulling things into like an Airtable database, like I've been doing, seeing things at different levels and different teams and working across, and kind of just be able to visually analyze these people using the different visual frameworks, and cutting by level, cutting by title, cutting by years of experience, or all sorts of things. You can do some very, very quick analysis if you can get the scores into a digital form and just do some heat mapping, kind of pulling out like the really strong people or the people that think they're really, really weak, and then you can try to see if you can normalize and see if they're good representations of that. And from the cards, you can kind of create, like, you can digitize these and kind of create some, like, analysis affinity map of, like, oh, everyone who says prototyping, these are the things you could do, and starts going to develop some casual courses and peer review rather than, like, formal courses for people. So what I've taken you through is just this process at a higher level, so kind of using these little frameworks to kind of prime your thinking and then use them to then identify where you want to develop. You can do this yourself, for your team, for your own individual self. And I created a whole series of Medium posts as an advent calendar challenge. So one for every day of December up until Christmas. Forgot about the weekends. That's annoying. I had a lot of weekends at work. And so there's lots of things around each of the tools and more than I've shown you here that explain their provenance and why they're useful. So definitely a useful resource for the community. And I'm also doing some analysis of some surveys of a number of designers that ClearLeft and Andy Budd put out last year, try to see what the makeup is of titles and roles and the skills people use across a larger sample. And the IXDA are looking to kind of like develop a bit of a framework and do an analysis across different local leader groups. And I'm still focused mostly on digital design UX, But I'm wanting to go deep on the user research with research ops community who are doing work in this area, and looking to extend to service design and product management because there's a lot of overlaps in those areas as well. So if you're interested in kind of helping with that, please reach out. But I just want to just kind of close with just some of the benefits of what's happened through doing this, because some of them aren't the ones that I set out for. I originally wanted to explain the differences, but I didn't realize how diverse people were, the different skills, different types of design. There's a desire to kind of encourage consistency across the organization, how things are termed. They can be used to kind of help to allocate people to the right projects based on their skill profile and also how they want to develop. And it can help you to hire to particular needs and gaps, or to strengthen particular areas of your capabilities in your organization. And also strengthen your own capabilities, identify your own ways to focus, and on an individual level and on the team level. And all of this is based on a kind of ability to help people to reflect on their activity, behavior, performance. And if you can kind of try and get this self-development culture thing going, I think it can be really good for general culture, and potentially could help to retain people for longer, because people have stronger relationships with the people around them in their teams than the organization some of the time. So some key emerging benefits from out of this work, which I think are important. But I've also learned some things that are sort of higher level around this. I think the most important one is that designers very rarely self-reflect. In fact, I think all of us in different degrees that struggle with self-reflection. We just don't do it enough. And it can be really, really valuable. Unfortunately, the tangible skills dominate, even though we know that the softer skills are more important a lot of the time. And as I keep on saying, I think that the organizations can self-develop. So I think there's an opportunity that people can start small and start today or tomorrow or the weekend and start to kind of find ways to research and reflect regularly. Use visual tools as a framing lens to do it. And they can be imperfect. You can use a whole range of different things. And you look across a range of competencies: hard skills, craft skills, human skills, foundational skills. And you can encourage learning within your organization. You don't have to go outside all of the time. I think it's important to just recognize when you're doing this, and I've come up against a few of these challenges, is that, number one, well, designers, like anyone, are human, but they are very delicate snowflakes. Remember, they're passionate, they're sensitive, they're incredible humans, but they are delicate. You have to treat them carefully. And all sorts of people that you will work with have a lot going on in their lives that they won't want to bring to work. They're hiding a lot of complexity, anxiety, like I did. So you've got to tread carefully. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do this, but you've got to be careful with emotions and just treat people with care. If people are feeling very uncomfortable doing this work, which they may, then it might be the right thing to do to kind of pull them out of the sessions. So let's find a way to do something more in human ways, not just spreadsheets. If we're designers, can't we be designing in a better way? So one last thing. I've been reflecting a bit on the story I told you in the beginning. I made some mistakes around this that led to this horrible email that destroyed me, but I've channeled that pain into something else. I've learned to kind of temper my provocations. I've learned to kind of play the long game and spend more time listening and taking people on a journey. And maybe just kind of saving more of my designerly flair for design community things, and just learn to kind of bring it down a bit. Thank you.